I rise to speak on this bill today, noting the many years that it has taken to see these laws brought before the Victorian Parliament. I'll state from the outset that I am saddened to see that for much of the public debate around this bill, and in the words promoting it from leaders in our community, no less the Premier of this state, the LGBTQIA+ community, who have fought long and hard for these reforms, have hardly been mentioned. Instead, politicians have weaponised this debate to focus on their own political aims, their own personal ambitions, in a political push to the community spanning a range of issues of their choosing, from public protests to the Maya Christmas windows. As I stated in my first speech to this chamber, I have seen my LGBTIQA+ community be used as a perennial political football. We are championed for cynical political gain when it is electorally advantageous, but we are cast aside when it is politically expedient. For too long, people in our community have been targeted and vilified just for being themselves. This is not on. The Greens, the community, particularly members of the LGBTQIA+ community, have fought and campaigned for years now to see anti-vilification protections expanded and for reforms to come to the Victorian Parliament and be passed into law. It is so important that we see this bill pass and work as it's intended to keep all marginalised members of our community safe from targeted hate and vilification. Over the past few years, we have seen some truly chilling events with increased levels of harassment, of abuse, of threats of violence directed at LGBTQIA+ communities as American-style far-right extremism becomes more prevalent in our country. Multiple family-friendly events held by queer people for the community have been cancelled due to threats. We've seen neo-Nazis emboldened and parading through our streets. Trans and gender diverse communities have particularly faced escalating anti-trans hate over recent years, with the Trans Justice Project and Pride Lobby report, Fueling Hate, in 2023, reporting that 1 in 2 respondents had experienced anti-trans hate in the past 12 months. This is not acceptable in our state. And should this bill pass, we still have a long way to go. We cannot legislate our way out of transphobia, out of homophobia, queerphobia, but we can hold people accountable for truly deplorable acts. That is what this legislation does. It draws a line in the sand of what's permitted as part of a public, robust discussion of diverse views that we celebrate here in the state of Victoria, and what is hateful vilification, these targeted attacks on people for being who they are, for loving who they love. To best ensure this distinction, we are seeking to move amendments to ensure that we are able to maintain this healthy, robust discourse and engagement here in this state, to clearly state in the purposes of this bill that its intention is to promote full and equal participation in an open and inclusive democratic society without impeding robust discussion. However, it's the targeted, vilifying behaviour that too often has been directed at people on the basis of being who they are, their personal attributes, often directed at members of marginalised communities like the LGBTQIA+ community, and particularly directed by those in positions of power and privilege. For this bill to operate as intended, power dynamics and context must be taken into account as they exist in the community. The context of those who are empowered with a platform and those who are most vulnerable in our communities to the targeted hate that we have been seeing. To this end, we are seeking to include via amendment the need for decision makers to consider the circumstances of the conduct, including the social, cultural and historical circumstances. This consideration would extend to all relevant people, both the victim and the alleged offender in criminal cases and the plaintiff and defendant in civil cases, and would necessarily include the consideration of any power imbalances between the relevant people. In addition, we are seeking to amend the purposes of the bill to explicitly state that the intent of the bill must be to protect people that experience systemic injustice and structural oppression, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. This tells courts, it tells tribunals, the Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission, the police, the Director of Public Prosecutions, that the intention of the bill is to safeguard individuals who face widespread, entrenched patterns of unfair treatment that are built into the systems, into the institutions, into the laws of our society, and that this should be taken into account when protecting those at risk of vilification, but also ensuring that those who are marginalised, those who are vulnerable or disadvantaged, are shielded from these laws being weaponised against them or applied to them in a discriminatory or an unjust way. Because this legislation is not about criminalising a person's right to practice their religion or to participate in our community or in legitimate public discourse, it should not impinge upon democratic rights that are key to the freedoms we enjoy here in this state, including the right to public assembly, the right to political communication. These amendments will help guide how this legislation should work in practice and enforcement. Having to consider the context and power imbalances when responding to vilification will help in preventing further entrenchment of structural oppression and systemic injustice for all people in our state affected by these issues. We also see our marginalised communities often simultaneously over-policed and underserved in justice outcomes, which is why guardrails are important around the introduction of these types of laws, and as such we will be seeking to retain the requirement for Director of Public Prosecution consent for the prosecution for a serious vilification offence. Now, my colleagues and I have been on public record with our concerns about the way the government has conducted themselves in bringing this bill before us. There is, and has been, throughout this term of Parliament, a progressive pathway for the government to pass legislation that makes our community safer, better for everyone. There should be no excuse for capitulating to campaigns from far-right groups who would see the continued vilification of marginalised communities, people targeted and vilified for being themselves under the guise of religion. We are therefore seeking to move amendments to the civil religious purpose exception within this bill. This is vital to ensure that LGBTQIA+ and other marginalised groups are protected from hate speech. As I've indicated for years now, we have seen people in positions of power and privilege in faith-based institutions use their platform to vilify and dehumanise members of our community on the basis of being who they are. This must end. We're also keen to see the latest commencement date of the bill be brought forward from 18 September 2027 into this term of Parliament, and will be supporting the amendment from Legalise Cannabis to this effect. And I'll just take this moment to thank my colleagues on the Progressive Crossbench for their support and collaboration on improving this bill, for clarifying its intent. As always, it's a great pleasure to work together with Georgie, with Rachel, with David on our suite of amendments, and to work together to achieve better outcomes for our communities. We have been clear with the government on our concerns in relation to what has been brought to this chamber, and thankfully the government has remained at the table with us. And we will seek to improve the bill to clarify its intent and achieve lasting protections for the community via the amendments which I've foreshadowed. The Greens will not apologise for fighting tooth and nail with the government on these matters, for staying at the negotiating table to make sure this bill passes and it works as intended to keep our community safe from this vilifying behaviour. Because this hate is not okay. It must end. To many in our community who have engaged in the process that has seen this bill come before us today, be it through inquiry, through consultations, through ongoing discussions with my colleagues and I, or others in this place, we see you, we hear you. I commend this bill to the House.